Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching First Opium War Part 4, Conflagration and Surrender by Extra History. So this is the last episode in Extra History series on the First Opium War. Last time we saw as the war was fought and supposedly brought to an end, but as we know, there is still more to come. Things will continue to spiral out of control. Now, each of these series, Extra History does a final episode called their Lies episode, where they go over anything they missed in these videos and any mistakes they made. I'll be reacting to that, but it will be a channel member exclusive. It'll be linked in the comments in the description, and so if you'd like to see that, you can become a YouTube channel member. And if you enjoy this video, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
With all the moderate voices out of the picture, there are only two ways this conflict can now go. The Chinese can drive the British from their shores and clamp back down on trade with the outside world, or the British can bring this great empire to its knees and force them to trade on their terms.
Yeah, and you can decide which of these two you think is more likely.
There could be no other resolution. When the Chinese emperor dismissed Qishan, he summoned 3 men to replace him and take over the efforts against the British. One was his nephew, who would serve as the main commander. The other 2 were officials and military men.
And you might remember that essentially last time a deal was worked out between the Chinese and the British, where Britain basically got all of its initial goals. They were able to get less restrictive trade, and China was able to avoid really serious consequences for the war, right? They didn't have to legalize opium, didn't have to give up territory, but the emperor refused this deal, and the British refused the deal as well, both because they thought they could get better deals. Now, the British were right. They could get a better deal, and they will. Now, you might be wondering, why would the Chinese emperor not accept this deal? And it's pretty clear that things were not going to go in his direction. But remember, this is still a time where, really in many ways, this first Opium War is China really being exposed to the global market in a big way for the first time. And so this is a moment where China still is, they're not completely cut off, right? But they're somewhat isolated from the globe. They still feel themselves to be this, powerful empire that they used to be, right? China still has this outdated idea of itself as the most powerful empire in the world. The thing is, the situation has changed. Politics have evolved, and that's just not the case anymore, right? China has been outmoded by the British, and will be, or already is outmoded by a couple of these other Western superpowers as well. So, just given how the emperor views himself and his country, he's thinking, there is no way my great and powerful nation will agree to this deal, which is giving away so much. But when we look at how the situation really is, China does not have much of a chance to actually come back. That's not how the emperor, at least, was seeing it.
Before they left, one of the officials recommended that they accept peace and let the British busy themselves with trade while they modernized and strengthened the Chinese army. But the emperor would hear of no such thing. They would take back what had been lost. Chinese forces now massed around Canton. Elliot was still there. He had been trying, with almost no success, to limit the opium that flowed into the now British-controlled port. And the same official who had tried to reason with the emperor now reached out to him, hoping that the large numbers of fresh Chinese troops he brought in would give him more leverage at the bargaining table, and perhaps get Elliot to agree to an even better deal than he'd already offered. But this would not be the case, and so Elliot started concentrating British forces, telling the British and American merchants in Canton to withdraw. By the 22nd of May, 1841, the Chinese were shelling the British factories in town. In the night, they launched fire ships across the river at the becalmed British forces. The great steamship Nemesis fired up its engines, powering out of harm's way. The fireships missed the rest of the fleet, sailing past and slamming into the port, setting the town on fire.
Sheesh.
A gun battle took place, but by dawn, the river was firmly in the hands of the British, and the fort guns the Chinese held were silenced.
Yeah.
Now it was the British's turn to go on the offensive. But that offensive was halted by a Chinese plea for a truce. 2 days later, though, one of the Chinese commanders decided to break the truce. Desperation had set in. They launched manned fireships to try to destroy the British fleet, but even this would not avail them. In the
Which
end,
is essentially a suicide mission. Yeah, not a good plan, brother. The thing is, the British have just got the military and technological advantage. They've got some of these new technologies they would very much like to try out in this conflict. The last episode was called Gunboat Diplomacy. It's not really gunboat diplomacy because there's no diplomacy. This is just them bringing their new gunboats into war. But I'll say this will very much set a precedent for future gunboat diplomacy, right? For example, only a few years, I guess a decade after this, the United States, under Commodore Matthew Perry, will essentially open up Japan to trade, right? In a situation not entirely different from this, but also not entirely similar, and that the US will use gunboat diplomacy, and in some ways, this example to say, hey, we're here with all our big, powerful ships. If you don't open up trade to us, look at what's going to happen to you. And they can point over to the Opium War, right? And so this is sort of that being put into action. What happens if you, as an Asian country, refuse to do trade on European or Western terms? Well, you're seeing here what happens.
the Chinese paid an indemnity to the British to not sack Canton, but riots by the peasants, looting by both the British and Chinese armies, and the complete lack of resolution on the matters of the opium, trade, and Hong Kong issues meant further conflict was inevitable. But as the British withdrew to regroup at Hong Kong, a typhoon hit. The cutter Elliot was on was smashed, leaving him swimming with the flotsam.
Oh,
He
damn.
began swimming hard for Hong Kong when, over the horizon, he saw a sail. It wasn't a British sail. It was the battened sail of a Chinese war junk.
Uh-oh.
He knew he had to swim for his life. Hong Kong was right in front of him. All he had to do was make it. Exhausted, he dragged himself onto the shore, only to be
That's crazy to actually I don't know how far he was, but to actually manage to avoid the ship and swim to shore. Rare.
greeted by the news that, actually, he was fired. He'd been
Damn.
fired 4 months ago. It was 1841. Getting news halfway around the world still took a while. And the men who
Damn, bro washed up on shore and found out he was fired. Tough.
replaced Elliot were far less open to finding common ground with the Chinese. They were here to expand the rights of the British Empire by any means necessary.
And to be fair, Elliot, I don't know if I'd say he was more compromise-minded, but Elliot really stuck to the initial goals the British had, and he had essentially achieved all of those, right? So it's not like he was compromising that much. It's just, now we're in a different situation, the war has begun, and these new fellas brought in, they're saying, we don't just want to achieve the goals we had before the war. We have a whole list of new goals and territorial concessions we'd like to achieve.
The war would no longer be interrupted by truces, ceasefires, and talks of peace. And thus the British began on their campaign north and east, capturing fortresses on their way. Each fortress wasn't just a victory in its own right, but a threat to the emperor in Beijing. Each fallen citadel was another jumping-off point that the British now held, ever closer to the Chinese capital. And this time, there would be no returning land. There would be no giving back territory unless all British demands were met. These islands and fortresses the British captured would be held hostage, not to be relinquished as a sign of good faith or as a part of an agreement to reach a peace, but only in exchange for the ransom the government back in England demanded.
Yeah, I mean, now Britain is operating from a position of superiority. And of course, they do have military superiority. So they're saying everything is going to be on our terms. If you don't give us what we want, then too bad. You're not getting your forts back. You're not getting your territory back. We can do whatever we damn well please.
As they took these fortresses, though, the British found a strange thing. Everywhere they went, next to the cannon, in the guard towers, they would find opium pipes. The Chinese resistance was weakened by the very drug they were supposed to be fighting against.
Damn.
From the officers all the way down to the enlisted men, much of the army was addicted to the drug. The British forces, on the other hand, were a mixture of discipline and severity. The new British commanders saw themselves as the civilized force in the conflict and forbade looting on the pain of death, and even prevented their soldiers from cutting off captured prisoners' queues for trophies. But when one of their soldiers was kidnapped and beaten during a resupply mission, they had no problem burning several of the nearby villages in retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, once again, it's interesting because both sides have the same view of the other that, we are the great glorious empire and you are the barbarians, essentially. I mean, that's how China put it. Britain might have put it slightly differently, but the same idea. But even if you view yourself as the great civilizer, that does not take away the violence of imperialism. It just means it happens in different forms, right? Your army, it's got structure, it's got order. You can't loot. Looting is forbidden. Everything needs to be done through our command structure. But, when one of our troops gets kidnapped and beaten, we will mete out extraordinary violence, right? So the violence doesn't go away, just the violence must now be done in an orderly manner, essentially.
As if they could train the population through punishment. As the winter of 1841...
And of course, Britain has got plenty of experience doing this at this time in their history, and they will continue to get more and more experience throughout the rest of this century.
Into 1842 passed into spring, and Chinese attacks became even more desperate. The retaliations simply became more brutal. But their advance pressed on. By the middle of June, Shanghai was taken, and then in July, Xinjiang, where we get a prelude of what's to come with the Manchu commander turning on the Chinese populace, illustrating the cultural and racial divides that would tear China apart over the next 60 years.
And what they mean by that, well, they mean a lot by that. There's a lot that could be said, but the Manchu government was a essentially separate ethnic group than the majority Han population, and that could create, and did create, tension at times, and that tension would continue to ramp up through the 1800s into the early 1900s.
After securing Xinjiang, the British finally moved on to Nanking. Both sides knew this would be the final showdown. The British wouldn't have to seize the capital at Beijing because Nanking stood at the entrance to the Yangtze, the river which was the heart of China. It was the superhighway down which all trade to the capital flowed. If Chinese access to the Yangtze could be cut off, the capital would starve, and much of the kingdom would be in chaos. So it all came down to this. It all came down to the capture of Nanking. But there would be no great showdown, no final battle, because the emperor finally began to realize that he was beaten, and that if they lost Nanking, there would be no negotiation, only surrender. So better to negotiate while he still could. He sent an official down to talk to the British. At first, talks went nowhere, as the British demanded that the official be given authority to make binding deals for his government, the lack of which the court in Beijing had taken advantage of in prior negotiations to get out of treaties made by other officials. Cultural misunderstandings and attempts to delay as long as possible by the Chinese officials delayed the process slightly further, but by the middle of August, under imminent threat of attack on the city, negotiations...
Yeah, the British are like, okay, you can keep delaying, but we are literally going to attack the city unless you come to the negotiation table right now and make a deal.
Commenced. In the end, though, despite technically holding Nanking, it was clear who had all the leverage, whose gunboats could impose their will if negotiations failed. And the Chinese ended up conceding on nearly every point. The 6 million that Elliot had asked for now became 21 million, and the amount was granted. A number of new ports for trade were opened up. The old Kohong monopoly was abolished, and tariff rates were to be agreed upon rather than set by the sovereign Chinese government. The island of...
Which is crazy. I mean, that in itself, that's already you giving away your sovereignty. Right? Tariff rates, I mean, that's literally your own economic policy. That's your domestic policy. We know how tariffs work, right? But now what you have is you need to consult with a foreign government to set your own tariff rates. Like that, I mean, you've already given up a chunk of your sovereignty there. And that's what all of this is, really, is that Britain does not want to play by China's laws and its regulations. They want to play by their own special set of regulations. And so what that means is you essentially need to weaken Chinese sovereignty and essentially either force them to impose certain laws and rules, or, force them to give you the latitude to do such things.
Tariff rates were to be agreed upon rather than set by the sovereign Chinese government. the island of Hong Kong was ceded in perpetuity to the British, and British subjects would operate there under British law,
Yep.
completely free from Chinese jurisdiction, and British consulates were
And as we talked about in a previous episode, that was the case up until only a few decades ago. Well, British controlled Hong Kong up until a few decades ago, and then there was an agreement that kept some British institutions in place. It's a little complicated, but essentially, Britain maintained control of Hong Kong up until pretty recently.
established at the treaty ports. The only two things that the Chinese didn't concede on were Christian missionaries, which were such a touchy subject that not even the British delegation tried to bring them up, and opium. The Chinese government refused to legalize opium, even though the British representatives tried to lean on them to do so. Even though they had no power to prevent its sale, they steadfastly refused to legalize the drug. This would eventually lead directly to the Second Opium War, a conflict which plays out shockingly similarly to the first, at least in the broad strokes.
Yeah, I was going to say there are definitely differences, but sure, I mean, broadly, a similar thing where Britain essentially gets into war with China again over, in reality, over trade restrictions. That's what it really is, and Britain wanting to exercise its own control over China's sovereignty. And you can see that here in the fact that opium did remain an issue, but what was more important to the British than the opium was getting those concessions, right? Gaining the ability to essentially, to a certain extent, control China's trade policy, and that power would only grow over time. That is what Britain wants more than anything else. They want power over China even more than they want to sell opium, and they really want to sell opium.
This time with most of the major colonial powers involved. These two wars, and the treaties which follow them, will go down in Chinese history as the unequal treaties, and begin what will later be labeled by the communist government as the Century of Humiliation.
Yeah, and that is what is known as in China today. Beginning with the First Opium War, you have the Century of Humiliation, which I suppose ends with the modern People's Republic of China, if I do my math right, or, around the time of the Second World War. And just think about that, right? This is known as your Century of Humiliation, right? These are the unequal treaties, right? That is how the people of China feel about it, because this is really sort of a blip in Chinese history where China had always been this great and powerful state. It had been the empire imposing itself on others, and now, for this period of time, you have these Western colonial powers, the Brits in particular, but others will get involved to come in, go to war, and essentially impose themselves on China, right? So, it's worth keeping that in mind when you think about China's mindset, really from this point onwards up until the present moment.
While at the time they may have seemed just a part of a larger destabilization and realignment of the country as a whole, they have since been seared into the Chinese consciousness, and to this day are conjured whenever dealings with the West take a turn for the worse. They are used as a milestone, a measuring marker for how far the country has come in the last 150 years, and as propaganda to remind everybody of that fact. And while these wars have perhaps the lowest casualty count of any of the conflicts that Extra History has covered to date, they have had a profound impact on global politics and global understanding all the way to today. The Opium Wars are long over, but their effects linger in significant ways.
Sure.
See you next time.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely true, right? As we sort of got at there, the impact of the Opium Wars, the impact of the Century of Humiliation on the Chinese psyche is still very much present today, and in the way they see the world, deal with everybody else, in the sense that China wants to be this powerful, self-sufficient, in many ways, country. Not to say it is self-sufficient, no one truly is, but it does alter the way they view everybody else. So there you go. You've got the First Opium War. Like I said in the intro, if you'd like to see my reaction to Extra History's Lies episode on the Opium War, you can become a YouTube channel member, and you'll find it linked in the description or in the comments down below. So thank you, everybody, for watching. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you're all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.